Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a podcast where, although we abhor disorder, we still have a secret fascination with how the other half lives, especially that other half who are Russian billionaires. They have super yachts, sometimes they're impounded under sanctions in San Diego. So today we are returning to the issue of Western dysfunction and coordination failures when it comes to combating kleptocracy and to implementing sanctions. Today's conflicts, whether it's in the Middle East or in Ukraine, are really more about economies and technology than they are about brute force anyway. And without the cash and advanced technological components from democratic Western and East Asian countries, neither Iran or Russia would be able to have the power in the world to wreak the havoc that they do. Fortunately, as we speak today, the financial sanctions against these regimes are actually more comprehensive than at any previous sanction regimes in human history. But today we ask the question, they may be more comprehensive, but are they effective? I simply don't know the answer. So to delve deeper into the question of how has the economic war against Putin worked, as well as what can we extrapolate in terms of lessons for other conflicts, I am joined by Stephanie Baker, author of Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. Stephanie is a senior writer at Bloomberg News. Her investigative reporting delves into everything from Russian oligarchs to sanctions against Donald Trump's finances, art market fraud, and COVID-19 vaccines. Welcome to Hampstead, Stephanie, the true epicenter of mega ordering.
Great to be here.
I don't know why, something about these brooding gray skies has me in a big picture mood. So why don't we start conceptual? To my mind, there are 2 theories of economic integrations with one's potential adversaries. And these theories have not changed over the last 100 years. Shall we call the first theory the Norman Angel theory, which is that as 2 states increase economic ties, it will be less likely that those 2 nations or 2 blocs will ever go to war. And then there is the converse theory, the leverage theory, which is that the more intertwined an evil actor becomes with its adversaries, the more leverage the one who is willing to do evil and buck international norms has, and the more it can resort to threats and blackmail, for example, like threatening to turn off oil or gas supplies. What are your thoughts on these 2 theories?
Right. So your first theory could also be likened to the McDonald's peace theory. If you remember, this was the Thomas Friedman theory that he advanced, I believe, in the 1990s, that any country that was developed enough to have a McDonald's wouldn't go to war because of their level of economic prosperity to engage in a war. Now, that has proven wrong by Russia, Ukraine in particular, and McDonald's did end up leaving Russia after the full-scale invasion, something I go into in the book.
And that we will come back to.
But, of course, your second theory touches on what we're dealing with right now, which is that we've had 30 years of economic integration between Russia and the West. Europe became incredibly dependent on Russian gas in particular, but oil as well. And that enabled Putin to weaponize energy supplies. But it also gave the West a degree of leverage and the tools to inflict economic pain on Russia as well. There are limits to both of these actions, and I would say that's one of the biggest challenges of the economic war, is the costs that the West is willing to incur to inflict economic damage on Russia.
That kind of makes it sound like the McDonald's theory or Norman Angell theory is absurd, because the more there is economic integration, the more fighting the war hurts yourself. In other words, there's the risk of, while I defeat the opponent, I'm causing a recession in my own economy. So could it be that if Russia and China became more integrated, they would have more leverage over us? Or is there still something with this golden arches theory? It just didn't get enough, which is that if Russia or China was so economically integrated with global markets, they wouldn't want to risk aggression over Donbass or Taiwan.
I think that the lesson we've learned over the past 2.5 years is that Putin doesn't care much about the economic pain inflicted on the country. He's managed to steal so much money. He's been insulated against some of the economic war. He's very angry about the sanctions. But I'd like to refer to Dalip Singh, who is Biden's Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics. And he likes to talk about this as which country has an asymmetric advantage over the other. So Russia has an asymmetric advantage over the West because it is a major oil and gas exporter. The West has an asymmetric advantage over Russia because of its possession of technology. And that is something that Russia has struggled to keep up with. And so you have to look at the two as operating in tandem. And I think oil is key here. And unfortunately, there are a lot of factors that go into the global price of oil, and that will affect Putin's ability to sustain the war and affect the West's ability to undermine his financing of the war.
And it sounds like you sketched an adversary, Putin, who might not care so much if his pocketbook is hurt because it hurts mostly the regular people. But it brings us back to the episode that we had with Bill Browder when Navalny was assassinated. And Browder told us, just as he's told many others, that sanctions that just hit the regular people don't work against these extremely dictatorial centralized regimes. But the whole idea of the Magnitsky Act and other forms of sanctions is to hit the regime elites where it hurts in their personal lives, in their personal pocketbooks. Has that shown that more economic integration makes war less likely, or just that these people stole so much money over time that if you just cut them off from a few billion, it doesn't matter?
Look, I think the people around Putin who were hit by sanctions are deeply disturbed and upset by this, by having their lives in the West cut off and having their world shrink. But I don't think that means they're about to rise up and turn on Putin. I don't think that's the way the Putin regime operates, unfortunately. I think it's a very risky proposition for anyone around him to rise up against him, and he has managed to enrich those in his inner circle in a way that they are tied in with his regime. I don't think Putin is about to be overthrown by his inner circle. And unfortunately, I think the sanctions against those elites have not proven effective in that way. I think they're useful on a broader economic level to try to undermine the Russian economy and hit the Putin war economy where it hurts. But I don't think they've proven effective in terms of creating political instability inside the Kremlin.
Delving into something that you raised there, why does it seem to be that post-Soviet or post-statist regimes like Russia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, why do they produce oligarchs? This harkens back to something that I talked about in our 2-part episode with Tom Burgess. And when I asked them, why are oligarchs needed? Why does the Kremlin or the regime in Kazakhstan, why doesn't it just keep all that under its own control? And his books, Kleptocracy and Cuckoo Land, they answer this question by saying it's because Western multinationals need to interact with something called Rusal or Gazprom or Surrogate Nifty Gas as if they were companies so that they can raise capital and interact with global markets. And the Russian regime needs to have layers of deniability when things go wrong. And in Libya, those layers of deniability are important. When they get sued in arbitration cases, they don't have to pay because it's not the Libyan state. I think your book sketches a different answer. So why does Putin need oligarchs?
Well, to be honest with you, there are some oligarchs he doesn't like very much and would love to get rid of. One of the remarkers of the Putin regime is how he increased state control over the economy. Under his presidency, state-controlled Rosneft, the oil giant, grew manyfold by taking over the assets of Yukos, which belonged to the oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Same thing with Gazprom. He increased the state's control over Gazprom, and the CEO of that company, Alexei Miller, is himself also considered an oligarch, though not a traditional one, because he doesn't actually own the asset. He controls it, and he gains his power through control.
But in a way, the comparison you're making there is vis-a-vis the Yeltsin period. In other words, that it's increasing control relative to the 1990s. And I agree. It's obviously less control than during the Soviet times. But why is these assets being privatized at all necessary?
Right. So when Putin took over, he had a crop of oligarchs who had privatized and bought these assets, some of Russia's crown jewels, metals, oil companies. And he did a deal with them, saying, you stay out of politics and I won't seize your assets. Let's not underestimate the political upheaval that would have resulted if he tried to undo those privatizations. So instead, what he did was he co-opted them into his mafia state, I'll say, and controls them by threats of seizure. And I think he preferred to create and maintain this facade that Russia was a market economy, that it had embraced capitalism. This was not a return to the Soviet period, and would allow them to continue operating. But this is not any normal private company-state relationship that you would see in the West. There's a far greater degree of control. And as Putin stayed in power longer, the ways of the Vori, the criminal underworld, took over the state. And I think you see a lot of these billionaires who have assets in Russia terrified that their assets are going to be taken away and that their personal security and the family's personal security may be under threat because they are so deep in.
If we go back to our episode with Marcel Dersis about how tyrants fall, he explains that the people close to the tyrant have the most power, and that the more centralized and oppressive the regime, think North Korea, the more power that those people close to the tyrant have. So the way you sketched it is at the end of the Yeltsin period, there were already these powerful established interests in fields ranging from aluminum to oil to maybe even consumer goods, and that they already had power. And if Putin had come in and been like, I'm taking all your assets, everything is the state, they either would have overthrown him, they wouldn't have played ball, they would be independent power centers. So he has gradually made a deal with them where the regime has actually been an oligopoly. And this gets back to Marcel Dersis's point, which I think you, in a way, sketch out very well in Punishing Putin, which is that even the most oppressive and dictatorial regime has multiple focal points, and that there is no such thing in human history as a state ruled by one person, certainly not one that spans 8 time zones. And the reason that the oligarchs are needed is that they are these different pivot points or axes and spokes of power. So if you look at that, you might think then it might be very difficult to sanction the guy at the top, but we have all these different spokes. If we could really hit all of those spokes in the way they interact with the global economy, that would weaken the regime, or they would turn on Putin. Why didn't they?
Well, I think on one level, the sanctions against the Yeltsin-era oligarchs, I don't think Putin cared about them. I think he tolerates them, he uses them, he manipulates them, he taps them for funds when he needs to for private purposes. So I think the sanctions on that circle, the first wave oligarchs, didn't bother Putin very much. The sanctions on the people around him who he personally enriched, often friends of his from St. Petersburg, who got rich off of state contracts or through appointments at state companies, those were people that he did care about much more. But they're not going to turn on him because they owe their entire wealth and their personal security to Putin. Trying to influence his calculus by imposing those economic costs has been difficult. I do think it's a useful mechanism and tool for bleeding the Russian defense industry of the resources it needs, trying to deny it the technology that it needs, because it is very dependent on Western technology. And I think he needs this war to stay in power. I think he needs the war economy to keep going to remain in power. I think it's a case of sanctions building pressure in the Russian economy, and you do see that happening.
So, it's really important to keep in mind that this war didn't start in 2022, right? Russia invades Georgia in 2008. They cede South Ossetia. We have sanctions and other stuff. And then in 2014, there is punishment for the annexation of Crimea, the violation of Budapest Memorandum. And we've known for a long time that Russia is the world's greatest disorderer. Why is it that for so long, BP and McDonald's, they were allowed to do business in Russia?
Right. So, important note, there were no sanctions after Russia's incursion into Georgia in 2008. And I think that was a crucial mistake by the then Bush administration to not respond to what was a clear violation of the UN Charter. 2014, an even more brazen violation of the UN Charter when Putin annexes Crimea and does this stealth invasion of Ukraine. And I think the lack of appetite for serious sanctions in 2014 was partly explained by the then situation economically. Europe was coming out of its debt crisis. The economies were still shaky. There really wasn't an appetite in Europe for any stronger action. Obama, his response was quite weak. I think there were still nerves about weak economic growth in the U.S. Coming out of the financial crisis. And I don't think Obama took Putin very seriously. And I think that was a big mistake in retrospect. And as a result, big companies like BP and McDonald's continued doing business. There wasn't this big public outcry that forced those two companies out in 2022. And, I think there are a lot of different reasons for that. I think the way the war now is being covered is very different. I think that brought it home. I think it's the first online war where we're having it all on our phones. And I don't think that was true to the same extent with Crimea. I think it was very hard to get information, but the images of tanks rolling towards Kiev just produced such outrage that I think it sparked a much stronger action.
I think you're very right there to criticize Obama-era policy. Anne Applebaum told us that, in fact, she argues that there was no policy. There was no coherent thinking about the end state that Putin's Russia would end up in and how we could guide them there, whether it was dealing with Medvedev as actually being an independent power center, rather than grasping he was just a puppet for Putin, or whether it was not having sufficient enough sanctions after 2014 to explain our resolve.
So I go into the 2014 response in my book, and I think there was a message that was sent to sanctions policymakers in the U.S. that they would only go as far as Europe was ready to go. And Europe just wasn't ready to push hard enough on this because they were far too dependent on Russia economically. And they developed these tools, which I think are very precedent-setting. They were targeted sanctions, denying financing for major Russian companies in a way that they thought wouldn't have a lot of blowback to the West. And that was a grand experiment. That had never been done before. And I think they did have quite an impact, coupled with a falling oil price at the time, at the end of 2014, beginning of 2015. It caused a mini currency crisis in Russia. And I think there was quite a bit learned during that period. They were able to take on bigger companies by denying them the ability to raise financing in the West and sort of gumming up the financial plumbing of Russia. But they weren't strong enough. They didn't go far enough. And I think they could have hit one of these big Russian companies with full blocking sanctions to really send a much stronger message. I don't think Putin in 2022 thought the West would be united or move as far and as fast as they ended up doing.
So going on to these mother of all sanctions after 2022, after the break, we're going to tackle, have sanctions on Russia been effective?
The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim is a brand new podcast from Sky News. With me, Sky News' lead world news presenter, Yalda Hakim.
And me, Richard Engel, chief foreign correspondent for NBC News.
Every week, we'll be reporting from the front line of the world's trouble spots and asking the big questions to the world's most important and influential people.
Join us for the ground truth to help you understand what is happening in the world today and why it matters to you.
So that's The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim.
Listen every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
We're back with Stephanie Baker. Her book, Punishing Putin, shows that capital flight from Russia in 2022-2023 reached more than $350 billion US dollars. That sounds like a lot. And it sounds like that would have been enough to really hurt Russia. And then there's this G7 oil price cap that has made Russia waste a lot of money buying old Greek tankers and trying to sell its oil by roundabout means. How has all this inefficiency created for Russia and capital flight meaningfully hurt Russia and helped Ukraine?
Well, the capital flight, which is almost $350 billion through the first half of 2023, that was enormous. That means that Russia has less access to domestic savings to finance or invest. The flip side of that is that many oligarchs who could not invest their money abroad started investing at home. And that did create a little mini construction boom within Russia. The oil price cap was this wonky idea that everyone thought would fail. It was a response to a planned or proposed EU embargo on Russian oil that would have banned the provision of Western services, insurance and the like, for oil from Russia. That had the Biden administration very concerned because they thought it would cause a spike in gasoline prices in the U.S. right before the midterm elections in 2022. And so they developed, U.S. officials under the Biden administration, the Treasury and the White House developed this oil price cap idea, which they sold to EU leaders. And it did work for a few months. They agreed a price of $60 a barrel. That meant Western services would be banned unless oil was sold below 60. And then Russia developed this shadow fleet of oil tankers to bypass these Western restrictions and ship oil to Asian markets outside of Western services. Now, it still had an effect. Even after they built that shadow fleet, there was a discount being demanded for Russian Urals crude oil, deeper than it was before the price cap was introduced. So it has had an effect, and Russia has had to spend billions of dollars leasing these oil tankers to transport Russian oil. But the problem with it is that the U.S. didn't enforce this crazy policy that they pursued so diligently for months and months. And I think that was out of concern that if they did really enforce it, they would be pushing Russian oil off the market and cause prices to go up. And then that again goes back to the central challenge of sanctions and economic warfare, which is that you don't want to be pursuing policies that hurt you more than you're hurting your target.
And it gets back to our initial question about economic leverage, which is that the more integrated you and I are economically, the more that my attempt to sanction you might end up hurting me because we have trade. And therefore, particularly democracies may have difficulty with sanctions as a weapon because they are receptive to people's desire for cheaper fuel at the pump or not having a recession in an election year. Whereas non-democracies that only need to keep 5 or 6 focal points happy and the 10 people around the leader, they may actually be able to bear more economic pain. I heard you explain ways in which these inefficiencies have hurt Russia. But could you tell us, have they meaningfully helped Ukraine?
I think Ukraine would like the West to go much further. And that's why you see Ukraine bombing through drone warfare oil refining facilities in Russia, because they're frustrated that the West isn't enforcing this price cap more rigorously. And they think if it did enforce it, it actually would drive Putin's oil revenues down. I think there hasn't been enough attention paid to using the sanctions to benefit Ukraine. I go into this in some detail about efforts by the Justice Department to seize and forfeit Russian oligarch assets for Ukraine. That's been really difficult. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of Russia's central bank reserves, which the West froze in the first 48 hours after Putin's full-scale invasion. There's been a big debate about whether or not they could go the next step and actually seize those assets and use them for Ukraine. That would probably make the biggest difference, but that has run into a lot of troubles.
And I'm going to drop in the show notes my article with USA Today about having a Navalny Act, which is the seizing of those assets to use for Ukraine's war effort that Bill Browder and I support. But there are various legal hurdles, and people are afraid that it could cause the Chinese to pull money from our markets. In terms of how these sanctions are working or not, Russia published its budget a few weeks ago. What does the budget tell us, Stephanie, about the effectiveness of sanctions in truly damaging the Russian economy?
Well, the remarkable thing about the Russian budget that was recently unveiled is that they hiked planned defense and security spending to $145 billion, 25% hike. But that's based on some pretty rosy assumptions. I think it's based on what could be a very optimistic price for Russian oil. But let's not accept the Kremlin line, without a critical view.
Sure.
Because Russia is facing some enormous challenges. It has inflation of 9%. It had to hike interest rates to 19% to try to cool those prices. So you have the central bank working in opposition to the Kremlin, which is showering all this money on the defense sector and recruiting soldiers for Russia's meat grinder in Ukraine. And you have a technocratic central banker that's trying to cool the economy because there's only so far that this can go. Russia's facing massive labor shortages. It needs to recruit something like 500,000 soldiers in the next year. And it needs to keep its defense factories humming at the 24/7 rate that they've been trying to do so far. And it doesn't have enough manpower to do that. And that's part of the reason why you've seen, in my view, Russia cozy up to North Korea, because North Korea not only is providing Russia artillery and ballistic missiles, but it might also be a source of labor. And I think that is something that we need to keep an eye on very closely.
That's very interesting, Stephanie. So is Putin also worried about secondary sanctions? And what I mean by that, listeners, is you can sanction a payment that is going via a Chinese bank or entity if that bank or entity is dealing with Russia. And we didn't necessarily impose all these secondary sanctions, but we have them teed up. Is that something that could really gum up the works of Russia's international finance?
Yeah, they haven't used secondary sanctions. And to be clear, I tried to avoid that term in my book because I thought that just makes people go, oh gosh, I can't understand this. I describe it as sanctions on foreign financial institutions that do business with sanctioned Russian entities. That would be a secondary sanction. So in December, Washington threatened to impose sanctions on foreign banks that do business with Russia, and then it widened that threat in June. And that has actually had a real effect. Suddenly, you see Chinese banks delaying payments. The cost of borrowing in Chinese yuan in Russia has shot up. And there is a gumming up of the financial system because Chinese banks don't want to be sanctioned and cut off from the US dollar. So I think it's unfortunate that they did not make those threats earlier, because even just the threat seemed to have had an effect. They didn't even have to go through with it. Imagine if they went ahead and sanctioned a Chinese bank. That would shut that business down very quickly. They've been very reluctant, Washington, to use secondary sanctions because it is a big deal.
It sounds like then that the economic war has mirrored the physical war, which is that there was so much hesitance to give the HIMARS and the ATACMS, and then hesitance, well, we gave them to them, but they can't shoot them into Russia, and then, oh, we gave them this, but we don't want them to have the planes just yet. And as soon as we let the Ukrainians have them, what do you know? They do the Kursk offensive, and they're doing better. And then everyone says, oh man, maybe we should have given them these things earlier. So it sounds like in the economic level, that is mirrored, that if we had deployed some of these things like the secondary sanctions or other more powerful tools earlier, Russia might have been more weakened?
No, absolutely. There is a parallel, and I point that out in my book, that in many respects it was a lot rolled out in the first 6 weeks to 2 months that were big, impactful sanctions, kicking all these banks off of SWIFT, the Gmail for the global financial system, the way they message to transact and transmit payments.
Crucially, the Russian central bank really didn't see it coming.
The central bank itself, they were not predicting at all. And you see that Russia had prepared its Fortress Russia strategy for years leading up to the invasion by reducing its holdings in dollars and increasing its central bank reserves in euros because they thought Europe would be too divided to act. And to some degree, they were right. They agreed to immobilize those assets, but the debate about going the next step and seizing them, that has been very divisive in Europe. There hasn't been agreement. The U.S. has actually moved on that, but there's only about $5 billion in the United States belonging to the Russian central bank. And Viktor Orban, the Hungarian leader, has been...
Ironically, now has the EU presidency. I mean, if you want to laugh when the Iranians chair the UN Women's Rights Council, or when I remember when Libya became the head of the UN Human Rights Board or something, even funnier is Viktor Orban being president of the EU.
You know, it's funny, but it's also been incredibly damaging to Ukraine because they might have been able to move on this loan for Ukraine, right? So because of the division over whether or not to seize all these assets, $300 billion pot of money, the U.S. proposes a fix that they are going to raise a loan of about $50 billion for Ukraine, backed by the interest payments on this Russian central bank reserve pot of money. But then Orban gets in the way of that because the U.S. wants this money locked up for a longer period of time before it commits to putting money ahead for this loan. And Orban refuses to do that. And, you know, that is still being worked out right now. Even Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission chief, has come up with a proposal to raise 35 billion euros for Ukraine, backed by those assets, but Viktor Orban has continued to frustrate that process.
Now let's talk about some more sectors where it is important to prevent specific items from getting into Russia. And now, of course, I'm talking about high tech and semiconductors. So you detail in your book that it's quite difficult to enforce these high-tech sanctions because although I might be a Russian company, I can create a shadow company in a place like the Baltics or Germany. And then they're not only in a NATO member state, but they can purchase from America some high-tech component, and then they just smuggle it into Russia. So have today's technologies made sanctions avoidance easier and enforcement harder? Or can we use technology to make enforcement easier and really deny the Russians, or potentially in the future the Chinese, the things that they need to wage sophisticated modern war?
So I think the war in Ukraine has been a real eye-opener. And in particular, what's happened is we've gotten a peek into Russian missiles to see how dependent the Russian military is on Western technology. I think everyone knew that to some extent, but now we've got documented evidence. And they're full of U.S. design semiconductors, integrated circuits, and other microelectronics that the Russian military needs. They're not able to produce this stuff themselves, or at least not on the same quality level. And so what you have is U.S. export controls, which are working in tandem with almost 40 countries to deny the Russian military access to this technology. But the problem is you have a U.S. company that maybe designs these semiconductors, but it's produced in Southeast Asia or in China. You have a company that's set up in Hong Kong, in particular, has been a venue for this, that says they're buying it for Chinese medical facilities, when in reality they're shipping them to the Russian military.
And a key thing is that everything these days is a dual-use item, because the things which are required to make cell phones and to make missiles and to make GPS or whatever are all the same components.
They are the same components. I mean, the Russian military would like components that have some special characteristics. They can withstand higher heat temperatures. But this has proven very difficult to control through customs authorities. I mean, most customs authorities are used to checking things that come into the country, not what goes out. And Hong Kong has not been a partner in the Export Control Coalition. So what they have done is the U.S. has threatened to impose sanctions on the financial institutions that are facilitating that trade. And that has proven to be more effective. It's still unclear to what extent, but I think it has caused trade to go down. But yeah, you're getting at a globalized supply chain that is very hard to control.
What was learned from the Deripaska, the Rusal aluminum sanctions that happened in the past? Could you give us a little potted history of how those sanctions spooked the market and what can be learned from them?
Right. So in 2018, under pressure from Congress, the Trump administration imposes sanctions on 7 Russian oligarchs, one of whom is a man called Oleg Deripaska, who controlled the largest aluminum producer outside China, a company called Rusal. As a result of those sanctions, because he controlled more than 50% of the company, there were sanctions automatically imposed on Rusal. Now, that caused aluminum markets to go crazy because people were expecting that the sanctions would mean that they could not do business with Rusal. This is a company that was supplying aluminum to car manufacturers in Europe. Now, some people in the U.S. Treasury said they didn't fully research what the effect would be on global markets. I mean, this is a global market for aluminum. This is a major global market.
It seems pretty obvious that it would have had that effect.
You would think. And what happened after that was a very complex set of negotiations to try to get sanctions on the company lifted, whereby Deripaska agreed to reduce his control of the company to just below 50% in exchange for having the sanctions on his company lifted. And there were all the other restrictions put in place on the company. And, so I think that really informed policymakers in 2022. You could see that they were very reluctant to impose sanctions on major metals producers, for instance, that would take supply off the market. And you see this today. Even, for instance, titanium. Russia is a major exporter of titanium. Companies like Boeing and Airbus rely on titanium from Russia in order to produce airplanes and the like. And they've been a conscious effort to not go there. Likewise, Russia has not weaponized its supply of titanium. It could have denied access to Western markets as a way of inflicting damage and hurt on the West in response, but it hasn't done so. So I think there are limits to this, and I think there are costs that would be imposed on each side and tiptoeing around those consequences that they didn't want to incur.
Speaking of aluminum, some people say aluminium, others say aluminum. And this gets at a London, D.C. enduring disorder issue, which is that the U.S. and the U.K. seem to frequently be on the potato, aluminium, looking differently at the same question. I'm wondering, now that Starmer is in power, can the Brits get closer to the American approach to Russian wealth, Russian oligarchs, and sanctions? Because isn't it the Tory party that was supposed to be compromised by all this Russian money? Are we seeing movement in Starmer's first 100 days to pronounce it aluminum?
So I would say that the U.S. and the U.K. have been very coordinated on sanctions for the first time since 2022. Of course, there are differences. There's certain people that they have not sanctioned, certain companies, but by and large, they have been on the same page. That's very different from the run-up to 2022 when the UK hadn't cracked down on Russian money in London and was reluctant to go after the so-called enablers, the fixers for some of these Russian oligarchs that were based here.
Like Helena Bonham Carter's cousin, who would have thought that he was one of these important fixers?
Right. So you had this reluctance in the UK to go after some of these people because they hadn't sanctioned some of these oligarchs. Their argument was, well, we have no legal basis for going after these people. But I do think, in fairness, the UK has moved quite aggressively to shut down Russian money in London. They've frozen £22 billion worth of Russian assets. Now, I'm not saying that that's job done. I think there's certainly potentially more. And there's certainly other enablers, fixers, lawyers, accountants, what have you, who could probably be in the crosshairs of some sort of legal action to root out sanctions evasion. But they have moved quite dramatically, I think, to go after Russian money and shut down Londongrad. And they had to stand up and massively expand a sanctions program almost from scratch.
Let's talk oil. Neither Russia nor Europe have wanted to halt Russia's production of crude or gas. So we've merely tried to minimize the amount of excess value that Russia captures from its crude oil production. And that's what the price cap that you talked about earlier is. And I really like this as an idea. And I'm going to sketch my vision to listeners so that we can talk about it relative to Iran. Imagine that some strategic commodities, silicon, oil, perfume, things that cost a low amount to produce, but then consumers are willing to pay a high amount for, there's a huge amount of excess value. And how that excess value is divvied up determines who gets the winnings off of that thing. Since 1973, it has really been producing countries who captured the most bit of their excess value. People may think that Exxon and Eni and Chevron capture a lot of the excess value of their barrel, but it isn't the case. It's really the land on which the crude is dug up from or the associated gas is trapped from. They're getting the most of that excess value. And that is why so much global wealth since 1973 has gone from consuming countries in East Asia, Northwestern Europe, and North America to producing countries in Russia, the Middle East, and Africa. How has this price cap thing maybe given us a vision of a way in which that balance, that post-1973 balance, could be rewritten?
Right. So the price cap was conceived as they wanted to create a club of buyers to leverage their buying power. Now, that did work to some degree. I think the idea was to keep oil flowing, but drive prices down and enable countries like India to get a discount on Russian oil. And that did work to some degree, and they are getting discounted Russian oil, perhaps not as discounted as some would like. But it was a radical idea, let's face it. It didn't work out quite as planned. I think India stepped up to buy more Russian oil than some anticipated. They pivoted much more than many thought they would and ended up taking Russian oil and refining it and then shipping it back to Europe. But I think it is an interesting idea.
So what are those lessons that we can extrapolate from the price cap in terms of the power of the consuming countries?
Well, one of the biggest issues, of course, is China. And what you see now is softening economic demand in China, causing prices to come down. Saudi Arabia, worried about losing market share, deciding to perhaps resume production and forego those higher prices. And I mean, there are limits to how much you can manipulate the global price of oil, given the complexities of global production, the OPEC plus cartel. This is really very difficult. And there's no one who's sitting there, pulling the levers and controlling this. There are so many different factors at play here. But look, like the long-term solution to this is to move away from hydrocarbons and into renewables so that we're not at the mercy of these dictators.
What a brilliant idea, a long-term solution. So, after the break, we're going to try to order the disorder and present some of these very simple, very obvious solutions like, what if we move away from hydrocarbons? And we're back with Stephanie Baker. She has given us lots of insights into what has worked and what has not worked in terms of fighting the economic war against Putin. Sticking with this price cap, because that was the issue that we were discussing just before the break. Could it have worked better if it was enforced better? Is there like a bureaucratic thing, which is that like the EU doesn't coordinate perfectly and the US and the UK don't spend enough on those agencies that do the enforcement? Should we just spend more money on those institutions that do the enforcement and then it will actually pay for itself?
That is one clear thing they could do. At the beginning, it was just a piece of paper that basically an oil trader would present and say, yeah, I've sold this for under $60 a barrel. There were very few checks. Another thing they could do is blacklist more of these shadow fleet tankers that are transporting Russian oil even outside the price cap, and then enforce the sanctions. In other words, make, for instance, Indian ports pay the price for accepting tanker that has been sanctioned by the U.S.
How do you do that?
Well, you would perhaps impose secondary sanctions on the company in India that is accepting this delivery or the port company. Obviously, that would be a huge move against India, which has tried to play this middle ground, playing each side off of each other, keeping relations with Moscow going while also accepting visits from U.S. diplomats. They're trying to play both sides here. But they could also do what they said they would do at the beginning, which was they would review the price cap regularly to see if it was effective and make changes accordingly. Now, as it was described to me, that in Brussels, they get into a room and they review the price cap and they say, oh, it's working. I think there was so much pain and compromises made when they agreed to set the price cap at $60 a barrel that no one wants to revisit that.
This is a key point of the enduring disorder, which is that the institutions that we have, whether it's the UN or NATO, or in this case, agreement like the price cap, they have so much friction associated with them because when you have so many different actors and it's so difficult to coordinate, even if something isn't working perfectly, it might be better to just let it go than to reopen it up because it'd be so difficult to get a replacement. Now, we've talked a lot about these details of the price cap. I'm quite interested in ways in which it might provide a template to deal with Iran. We, to some extent, need Iran to produce oil so that its own people don't starve and that the world and the Gulf don't have a recession. But how can we prevent the mullahs capturing so much excess value, which they then use to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis? Can this price cap and sanctions and some things that have been learned in dealing with Russia be applied to Iran?
I'm not so sure about that. And you may know more than me because you probably know more about Iran. But from what I understand, the Iranian oil trade doesn't use Western services. It doesn't use Western insurance providers. So that's the leverage that they've got on.
It was starting to when the JCPOA was put into action. And the JCPOA, that's the Iran deal that Obama brought in. And of course, there was going to be more Total and others operating in Iran. But because of the infinite genius of Trump, by cutting them off from the JCPOA, we let them do whatever they want without imposing penalties. But then we have nothing else that we can hit them with and sanction them with.
Right. So I don't actually think the price cap is a very good policy when it comes to Iran. I think that just doesn't work. I think it worked uniquely in Russia's case because Russia had been so dependent on Western insurance services. And I think obviously the big danger now is they're using a shadow fleet with very questionable insurance so that if there is a major accident, I think there are real doubts as to whether or not the insurance policy backing up this shadow fleet would actually honor any claim.
And this is a huge issue because it's the Western countries who are likely to have to bail it out because it's going to be running aground in Sweden or Denmark in their territorial waters trying to get out through the Baltic. And then the Russians will be like, there's this oil spill. We're not even going to pay to fix it up. So this is not a great solution. We are facing an increasing confrontation with Iran. Whether or not you support Israeli militarism towards Iranian proxies, or whether you side with me that Netanyahu might have been going way too far and causing way too many war crimes, we're still in an economic confrontation with Iran. So what can we take away from this? Particularly if you think that the military means of this war with Iran might not be moral, we should probably double down on some financial means, no?
No, absolutely. And I think what you saw was Russia using Iran's playbook as a way of transporting oil to Asia in particular by having these vessels turn off their AIS transponders to hide where they really were. They were doing these risky ship-to-ship transfers. This is something that Iran really wrote the book on, right? Then Venezuela learned from Iran, and then Russia learned.
It's exactly as Brian Klaas has told us. Disorderers copy from each other, and there's like an authoritarian states playbook where they love doing intra-authoritarian learning.
Well, and I think this is the biggest challenge now, is that you do have, whatever you want to call it, axis of upheaval, axis of authoritarian states.
Or just disorderers.
But you do have them helping each other, and they're banding together. Iran is sending drones to Russia. North Korea is sending artillery and missiles. Russia is giving North Korea oil and food. And so trying to break up these networks between sanctioned states, I think, is the next front. And it's part of what I tried to explain in the book, that people think that sanctions are just, you slap a sanction on somebody and you're done. Well, that's not how it works. It's like any war. It's a dynamic situation.
And Clausewitz said that war is adaptation and imitation, and there's no reason that economic war should be any different. One of the things we need to do in terms of our adaptation is having the Western countries on the same page. So we're sitting in North London. Britain is by far the most important jurisdiction for sanctions because Londongrad is where the money is flowing in and out. And you've written about this new British combating kleptocracy cell. But you told the fascinating story of when they tried to raid the Russian oligarch who owns Alpha Bank, Mikhail Friedman. They didn't have the right warrants, or it had the wrong date or something. It's a bungled raid, and it wasn't able to work. What can Britain do to enforce these sanctions better, to seize and freeze and claw back assets to give to Ukraine?
So I think that the UK made huge progress in terms of imposing sanctions on a lot of these Russian oligarchs. Many of them were using London as their base. And so as a result, you have these huge mansions in London, often in North London, that are standing empty because they are frozen. What the UK has not been as good at is the enforcement actions. And that's partly because the institutions they have set up to track some of this stuff, the National Crime Agency, for instance, is not resourced properly. The NCA doesn't have the kind of resources to go after cases like the FBI does, and it doesn't have the history or the expertise that I think has been built up by the FBI over years to do it.
So let's talk about further measures the West could take. What about the role of Switzerland? And I was just in Dubai recently, and of course, the Russian role from being almost nothing 5 or 10 years ago to the massive part of the UAE economy, which is catering to Russian expats now. The UAE really needs America for its defense, and it needs America for its positionality in the world. What can we do for these states like Switzerland and the UAE to bring them into our efforts?
Right. Well, Switzerland is following EU sanctions. Obviously, there are unique enforcement challenges given the amount of Russian money in Switzerland. I think UAE is a much bigger challenge. And I did go to the UAE for reporting for this book. The UAE has come under major pressure from the US to clean up its act and stop accepting sanctioned money. But the model that the UAE is set up, they are positioning themselves as sort of the Switzerland of the world. They are neutral in the economic war. They will only fully enforce UN sanctions. The numerous officials I spoke to, and I go into this in somewhat great detail, they say, well, if someone's sanctioned in the EU and the US, it doesn't necessarily mean that we won't accept their money. Now, because of pressure from US officials and European officials, they have in turn put pressure on banks in the UAE to make it harder for them to open bank accounts for Russians. There are more checks in place. The UAE was put on the so-called gray list by the Financial Action Task Force. They were able to get off the gray list through some limited actions, including cleaning up and introducing more checks on their real estate sector. There are a lot of Russians that went to UAE, to Dubai, after the full-scale war started, and they bought mega mansions on the Dubai waterfront at a time when there were no checks. And I think one of the biggest challenges with the UAE is that Dubai is trying to turn itself into a cryptocurrency hub. And there's still massive cryptocurrency exchanges that are able to exchange money coming from Russia to buy assets in the UAE. And that's the backdoor route that Russians are using now.
Let's return to the question of how sanctions might have been used to turn the oligarchs against their political paymasters. You wrote that back in 2022, and I quote, "Many people assumed that blacklisting Russia's elite would make them turn on Putin." That seems that it hasn't worked at all, because even Roman Abramovich didn't really turn on Putin, and he wanted to mediate and be neutral. And then other oligarchs, like you mentioned Oleg Tinkov, he tried to help the West, but he was forced into a fire sale of his assets for being disloyal to Putin. So it seems like attempts to turn the oligarchs have actually turned the oligarchs towards Putin, because their pocketbooks are more in showing loyalty to Putin than in avoiding sanctions. So knowing what you know now, how would you have designed these sanctions differently if our goal was to get the oligarchs to turn?
This Russian entrepreneur, Oleg Tinkov, who has been likened to the Richard Branson of Russia. He started various companies on his own. He's not an oligarch like the others were. He did not participate in the controversial loans for shares privatizations of the 1990s. He's essentially a self-made man. He was sanctioned by the UK. Despite him coming out very strongly against the war and against Putin, extremely critical in public forum on his Instagram channel. And it took him more than a year to get sanctions lifted. Despite that, despite him having renounced his Russian citizenship, and his criticism of the war meant that his main business, Tinkoff Bank, was taken over in Russia. He told me he lost $9 billion. And yet the UK was so slow to lift sanctions on him. That should have been an obvious thing to do. I think if they wanted other Russians to come out against Putin, they could have more quickly signaled through figures like Oleg Tinkov, if you come out against Putin, you renounce your Russian citizenship, you basically choose, you pick the West, that there could be a lifting of sanctions. Now, that's controversial. There are plenty of people who think, and I believe this to some degree, that the oligarchs are propping up Putin. They are the DNA of Putin's Russia. They form the building blocks of the Russian economy. Giving them a free pass just because they come out against Putin maybe is not really the right way to do it. And I think the UK officials were very reluctant to be seen to be providing any kind of quid pro quo for any of these actions. And I understand that. But there was also potentially a way to get them to donate their assets to Ukraine. Now, I think very few of them would have chosen to do that.
Like Abramovich, yeah.
Well, not only Abramovich, but even the others. Like, you could say, we will lift UK sanctions, unfreeze your assets if you come out against Putin and you agree to donate 90% of your assets to Ukraine. I don't think any of them would have taken that deal. But that's the only way I could have seen to destroy the oligarchy in Russia and provide assets to Ukraine. Now, even that, I think some Ukrainians would dispute is a worthwhile way to go about it. But I actually think that would have been a decent offer, at least, whether or not any of them would have taken it, given the mafia state that they had to deal with back in Russia and former colleagues that would have paid the price, family members, given the state of Putin's grip on the security services and his tendency to just throw anyone in jail for the slightest opposition to the Kremlin.
Why didn't the West hit Russia with the kitchen sink from the start? I understand that the very nature of sanctions is that it's a threat and it isn't about its immediate impact. It's like, we're going to do this, but don't do more. We want to prevent you from doing that. So if you do everything in the beginning, you can't threaten to do more. But wasn't it just the global enduring disorder here, the inability of Western nations to coordinate effectively, or for our leaders to take big risks and bold actions? In other words, we were afraid if we sanctioned more or did more, Putin might go nuclear, and that there was a degree of timidity?
Yeah, I mean, they were timid. I think there wasn't enough planning before the full-scale invasion. We were too slow. And to this day, there are carve-outs that I think should be ended, including oil supplies to Hungary from Russia and Gazprom Bank, which is one of Russia's major banks that has not been cut off of SWIFT, to allow payments for Russian gas to continue.
That's a great suggestion, Stephanie. So now we are on to your last chance to order the disorder. And this is my regular Queen for a Day question. On the last page of your magisterial punishing Putin, you write, I found no one who is thinking beyond contain and degrade, end quote. And for me, this was very tragic because it harkened back to so many of the conversations that we've had with Anne Applebaum, Bill Browder, Tom Burgess, Tenna Prelek, about the West's interaction with kleptocracy and corruption and human rights violations in Russia. So why aren't our policymakers thinking deeper? And if you were queen for a day and could create a global working group among democratic countries to plan for the day after Putin, how would this working group work? Who would be included? What would they plan? And what would they set in motion now to prepare for that day after?
Oh, that's such a hard question because I feel like if I were queen for a day 10 years ago, it would be such a different answer. Look, I think oil is key in terms of trying to undermine Putin's ability to continue with the war, and lowering the price cap dramatically and really enforcing it would have a huge impact.
Capturing more of that excess value for us.
And I think it's a myth. I think there's worry that Russia would withhold oil. That is number one, oil. And technology is the other one. Really lean on some of these U.S. semiconductor companies to clean up their act, to impose the kind of compliance and checks that banks have been forced to adopt would really help deny Russia access to the technology it needs for its defense sector and its precision-guided weaponry.
Those are two great suggestions, but just for a clarification, when you're queen for a day, you need to bring into being a new institution or body or working group that actually does that. Because I have great ideas, you have great ideas, but they don't happen because we don't have the structures in place to do them. So what is the structure that is needed among the allies to make those two suggestions happen?
You're getting at the fundamental challenge facing the West on this, is that the institutions that we have been using are crumbling, and notably the UN. Just look at what Russia did in March of this year. It pulled out of the panel of experts inspecting North Korea and its sanctions program to try to limit its nuclear capabilities. And I think that's created an existential crisis for the United Nations. So whether that is a new type of NATO-type alliance, but for economic sanctions.
You heard it here first, mega orderers. She said a new NATO-like alliance for sanctions, and I didn't even have to tell her to.
But you still face the same problems with countries like Hungary that are spoilers and are going to frustrate that process every which way. And whether or not there's a point at which the EU says enough is enough, I don't know.
Well, on that note of cautious optimism and cautious pessimism, it has been a real pleasure for me to speak with award-winning Bloomberg journalist Stephanie Baker about her new book, Punishing Putin.
Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please tap follow wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to hear more about Stephanie's work or hear some of the greatest hits that we've done about this Russia, sanctions, other themes, please follow the Substack. The link is in the show notes. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. And I am wishing you an orderly and sanction-free week.